All right, we're going to get started now. My name is Greg Caruso. I am director of the Patrick J. Waide Center for Applied Ethics here at Fairfield University. Welcome to our seminar series. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the Waide Center, then I'm going to introduce our speaker for the night. I just want to tell you a little bit about the format. The speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, and then that'll be followed by a period of Q&A where you're able to ask questions, and that will last about 45 minutes. And we'll try to wrap things up around 5:30 or a little earlier. Um, the only thing with the format is that the attendees won't be able to be seen by the speaker, but if you use the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, I will unmute you during the Q&A and you could ask your question, or if you feel more comfortable, you could type your question into the chat box and I will read that question for you. Um, just a word or two about the Waide Center for Applied Ethics. We have three strategic missions here at Fairfield University. It's curriculum, research, and outreach. We offer a host of different applied ethics courses across the disciplines, including business ethics, environmental ethics, AI ethics, engineering ethics, and a host of other applied ethics courses. We also support research conducted by both students and faculty. And we organize a number of outreach efforts, including seminar series, events at the Quick Center, speaker series that are directed either towards students or to the general public, all in an attempt to increase the dialogue on leading ethical issues about our time. The seminar series is a forum for building community and advancing research in applied ethics. We encourage jargon-free and supportive discussions that will be accessible to participants who have an interest in ethical issues. Invited speakers usually present a work in progress or something recently published on a topic in applied ethics. And again, about half of the meeting will be designated for Q&A. So I'm very excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Julian Savulescu, who will be talking about the ethics of polygenic editing and selection of embryos. Julian is an award-winning ethicist, medical doctor, moral philosopher. He's trained in neuroscience, medicine, and philosophy. He is currently and has been Uhiro Chair in Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford since 2002. He also currently holds the Chen Su Lan Centennial Professor in Medical Ethics and head of the Center for Biomedical Ethics at the Yang Lu Lin School of Medicine at the National University of Singapore. In 2003, he founded the Oxford Uhiro Center for Practical Ethics and was responsible for attracting a significant donation from the Uhiro Foundation on Ethics and Education to evolve the center into the Uhiro Oxford Institute, which it now is. And he was also editor of the BMJ Journal of Medical Ethics for over 10 years. He's the author of numerous articles, as well as books authored and edited. Those are just a few of his books: Unfit for the Future, The Need for Moral Enhancement, Human Enhancement, and Love Drugs, The Chemical Future of Relationships. So I'm very honored and very excited to introduce today's speaker, Julian Savulescu. So I will just unshare my screen and pass it off to you, Julian.
Okay, thanks very much, Greg. So I aim to sort of talk for about 45 minutes and then to have questions. And Greg asked me to talk both about polygenic editing and selection and moral enhancement. So I'll try and split my talk up into two halves. The first part talking about polygenic selection and editing, and the second part talking about the use of that technology to make people more moral. So imagine that you're at the beach and you find a small brass lamp and you rub it and a genie appears, and the genie says to you, here's a pill. If you take this pill, I guarantee you that you will never develop diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, depression, or schizophrenia. And there are no side effects to this pill. Would you take it? And I certainly would take it. There is no such pill, but there is polygenic editing of embryos. So we published this paper in Nature. that used statistical genetic methods to predict what the effect on common diseases of polygenic editing would be. So just to backtrack, what is polygenic editing? It's the sort of latest in a long line of scientific advances that began with genetic engineering in the 1970s. Most of these methods used viruses. And I'll talk a little bit in the second part of the talk about the power of that technology to alter non-human animals. On the right, you can see super mouse who can run at 20 meters a minute for 5 kilometers instead of 200 meters, which is the normal for a mouse. But there are fluorescent mice, rabbits, and monkeys that have been created by the introduction of genes from jellyfish. And there are even voles that display different mating behaviors. Through genetic engineering, they become monogamous rather than polygamous. Gene editing is the latest advance in genetic engineering, and it involves much more precise modifications of the genome using the CRISPR-Cas9 system. And there are more precise versions, such as prime editing, that have even fewer off-target mutations. And you'll all be familiar with this technology. The Chinese biophysicist He Jiankui gene edited 3 embryos and produced live babies in 2018, attempting to make those babies immune to HIV. We don't know what the outcome of that experiment was, but the babies were born alive. And this was proof in principle that you could modify a single gene. So this would be applicable to single gene disorders like cystic fibrosis or thalassemia. But what if it became sufficiently safe? And gene editing is widely used in non-human animals, in agriculture, and the rate of off-target mutations has consistently dropped, and up to 50 genes have been simultaneously edited in non-human animals successfully. So most of us don't suffer from single gene disorders like cystic fibrosis or thalassemia. Most of us suffer from diseases which have a significant genetic contribution, but that genetic contribution arises from hundreds of genes, not a single gene. These are so-called polygenic diseases and include cancer, heart disease, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, Alzheimer's disease. And these diseases cost trillions of dollars. I'm not suggesting these are caused in a one-to-one way like single gene disorders are, but there is a significant genetic disposition to common diseases. So what would happen if we could eliminate these genetic risks? This is becoming increasingly possible, where large genome-wide association studies have begun to identify thousands of associations with disease risk and genes. These so-called polygenic risk scores can predict disease. And one baby, Aurea, was born as a result of polygenic selection from a range of embryos. But the problem with polygenic selection of embryos is that you will only have, say, 20 embryos, 10 or 20 embryos to select from. But most of these disorders have tens or hundreds of genes associated with them. Now, at the moment, there are only associations, not causal variants identified. But what if we do eventually identify the small causal variants that contribute to polygenic risk? This paper modeled what would happen if the top 10 variants for 5 polygenic diseases were modified. So you'll see on the right-hand side that you would essentially eliminate type 2 diabetes from the population if you modified just 10 variants, the top 10 contributing variants. And coronary artery disease would similarly be almost eradicated. Now, those are striking findings way beyond the capacity of any drug to modify these diseases. So again, you can see the as you edit the increasingly edit the number of genes, the magnitude of reduction in prevalence increases to something like 50 times with type 2 diabetes and around 30 times reduction with coronary artery disease, and also significant reductions in Alzheimer's disease, schizophrenia, and major depression. And on the right-hand side, you can see the massive orders of magnitude reduction in the parameters that indicate risk, like fasting blood glucose, LDL cholesterol, and so on. So you could go further and not just modify 10 genes, you could modify 100. And at that level, you would essentially eliminate the risk of these common diseases. Alzheimer's disease, you could reduce the risk from 5% to 0.3%. Now, there are individuals who are extremely lucky. Evolution does not have any eye to human happiness or well-being. It simply enables us to live long enough to reproduce. But there are some individuals who get a genetic lucky hand and have an extremely low risk of common diseases. So 1 in 2 billion people would have the 10 favorable variants that protect against Alzheimer's disease. 1 in 3 billion would have that constellation for schizophrenia. Gene editing would enable everyone who was edited to have that genetic lucky hand. And of course, it's not just disease that that has a genetic contribution. Everything about us, our character, our psychological traits and abilities, our intelligence, our disposition to violence, our capacity to love, have genetic contributions. They are not caused, but again, there are genetic contributions. And you'll see in the footnotes to that paper or the reviews, there's 50 pages of reviews and responses to reviews that we had to eliminate the discussion of predictions around polygenic enhancement. And you can see the reasons for that in the paper. But the modeling showed similar, 5 standard deviations of increase in non-disease traits. For example, it predicted that IQ could be increased by 75 points, height by 50 centimeters, and body mass index also significantly reduced. Of course, there are many ethical concerns with this. One of the major concerns is the concern for increasing inequality as the rich have access to this technology and have healthier or more intelligent, more talented children. And Gattaca was the film that captured this concern about a two-tier genetic society. And that certainly is possible. These concerns can be reduced through regulation, and in countries that have publicly funded healthcare, such as most of Europe, Australia, and other countries, Singapore, then you could make polygenic editing available as other disease prevention or treatment interventions are made available. Eugenics is another objection that is raised to any kind of genetic modification or selection. Eugenics literally means well-born, and it's the use of knowledge about heredity to improve future generations. and it was associated in the 19th and 20th centuries with genocide, mass sterilization, forced abortions, and polygenic editing could be used by totalitarian regimes for eugenic ends. However, clinical genetics and using, say, Down syndrome screening are also eugenic practices. And what differentiates acceptable eugenics in the form of modern clinical genetics is that it's voluntary and it's not aimed at a state vision of a population. It's aimed at the well-being of the child. And this is the basis for prenatal screening, public health advice around delaying reproduction after being exposed to Zika virus, or pre-implantation genetic testing and pre-implantation testing. So in the paper, we summarize a large number of ethical arguments in favor and against the use of polygenic editing for disease. And I don't have time to go through all of those arguments. What I did propose was what's called a translational pathway, a way in which we could safely proceed to performing polygenic editing for disease and then for enhancement purposes. And it has 5 stages. So the mistake with He-Jian Kui's experiment was a simple design error where he took embryos that had no significant genetic risks in the form of single gene disorders and exposed them to the risks of off-target mutations and developmental abnormalities and cancer for no necessary benefit. You can avoid HIV in many ways, and there are also treatments today for that disease. So he exposed them to risk without commensurate benefit. If he'd taken an embryo with a lethal genetic disorder like Tay-Sachs disease, which is lethal in the first few years of life, then the embryo would have had, or the future child would have had much to gain and very little to lose. So the cost-benefit ratio would have been more favorable. And I could have defended the experiment if it had involved embryos with lethal disorders. And if you showed that it was safe and successful in a lethal genetic disorder, you could move to conditions which don't involve death, but involve severe cognitive impairment. And if it was shown to be safe and effective there, you could then move to disorders like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's disease that have either periods of normal life or substantially good quality of life. And if it was shown to be safe and effective, then you could move to prevention of infection, as he did, or chronic diseases such as heart disease and diabetes. And finally, you could move to enhancement. So in each of these cases, you need higher levels of safety as the benefits, the expected benefits are lower. What do the public think about the use of this kind of technology for either screening of embryos or for editing? Michelle Meyer and colleagues did a survey in the United States of attitudes to the use of a service that would increase the likelihood of getting into a top 100 US college from 3% to 5%, assuming 1 in 10 people were using that intervention. So this is a very small increment, and they stipulated that the intervention was perfectly safe. And they asked about its moral acceptability and people's willingness to use. So the 3 services were gene editing, PGTP, which is polygenic testing using polygenic risk scores, and SAT preparation. And they showed, first of all, that younger people and people with more education are more willing to use it. And roughly around 30% of people, well, 30 to 35 to 40% of people would be willing to use gene editing for this very small increase in chance of getting into a top college. And around 50% would use polygenic selection of embryos. Now, interestingly, only about 30% of people were thought it was outright wrong to use polygenic editing. The rest were either not sure or thought it was acceptable. So that shows actually very little resistance to polygenic editing, and only 17% were opposed to polygenic selection. So this was quite striking. Um, so that you often hear that this is unethical and you shouldn't do these things, even if they're safe. But the general public don't think that. So we repeated this in Singapore, and just to sort of cut to the chase, we found even higher levels of acceptance, particularly in the Chinese population, and greater willingness to use. So even though the levels were high in the US, at least in Singapore, but I predict in other Asian countries too, particularly China, there would be an increased willingness to use this sort of technology. So again, this is another Pew survey around enhancement that shows lower levels of acceptance. But even in India at this time, people thought it could be used 64% to make a more intelligent baby, and only 26% thought it shouldn't be used. So that's the public's attitudes and the potential. I now want to move to another another application, and that would be to not make people more intelligent. Um, End slideshow, click to exit. Okay. So let me just get this up and start sharing again. But to make people more moral. So why would we want to do this? Well, let me start by a small quiz. What is the cause of climate change? And the answer most people would give would be carbon emissions. What's the cause of terrorism? And most people would argue religious fundamentalism. What's the cause of the Fukushima nuclear disaster? Earthquake and tsunami. But those are not the causes. Those are the symptoms of the causes. Even in the case of the tsunami, which is a natural disaster, we know that tsunamis occur. We know how to build reactors in a position that they wouldn't be vulnerable to destruction. So in all of these cases, the actual cause is human choice and human behavior. It's the result of our psychological dispositions, our limitations, and our choices. So, for the first time in human history, our fate this century will be largely determined by the choices that we make, rather than some event like the Earth being struck by an asteroid. Now, these are old slides, so I haven't been working on this topic for some time, but arguments are even stronger now than they were when I wrote the book Unfit for the Future in 2012 and started working this in 2008. This is a mouse with mousepox virus. Researchers in around the early 2000s were looking at how they could make a vaccine against mousepox, and they modified an interleukin gene and unexpectedly created a super lethal form of mousepox. And this killed 100% of mice. Now, mousepox is very similar to smallpox. Smallpox kills 30% of people that contract it. If you come within a meter or 3 feet of somebody with smallpox, you'll contract it, and there's a 30% chance you will die. So smallpox was eliminated through a global vaccination program, but there are two small stores in Russia and in the United States of smallpox. You could modify that smallpox to make it not 30% lethal, but 100% lethal. And because it takes 2 weeks to realize that you have the infection, it's an ideal biological weapon. Um, and not only could Russia and US authorities release it, but you could construct it very soon, if not now, in a small backyard laboratory. So on the right is poliovirus, that is smaller than smallpox, but that has been artificially constructed using subunits available on the internet. So COVID was, compared to smallpox, an incredibly puny um, virus. It killed people over the age of 60, 65, essentially. Your risk as students of dying from COVID is about the same as your risk of dying in a car accident each year. Through most of human history, no one would have realized that there was a COVID pandemic because people would be dead by the time um, they um, they would contract, or the COVID represented a lethal risk. Smallpox, however, was the great scourge of humanity. This is a picture of a child with smallpox. It affects everyone. So it only takes one out of however many billion people there are, 7 or 8 billion, I haven't kept count, to decide to release smallpox in 12 major cities. And before you realized that you had a pandemic, it would be out of control. So we were completely unable to deal with COVID. Not completely unable, but the responses were very um, misplaced, and we're still suffering the economic and social consequences of the responses to that pandemic. Smallpox would be uncontrollable. So, as I mentioned, on an evolutionary picture of humanity, we're not born in the image of God. We evolve as animals capable of surviving and reproducing. And we have a whole variation of genetic talents and abilities. We evolved from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, um, but we've evolved in terms of our social structures and our technology extremely rapidly. We emerged from our previous ancestors a couple of 100,000 years ago, and in evolutionary terms, that's the blink of an eye. So we have essentially the same psychology in evolutionary terms as our hunter-gatherer ancestors, but the world we've built today is globalized. Um, and the problems that we have, such as the failure to correct global inequality and provide aid to the world, um, are the result of psychological biases that are aimed at facilitating life on the African savanna in small groups of 100 to 150. Um, so we don't see that we're responsible for what we fail to do. We have what's called a causal sense of responsibility, that we think that we're responsible only for the things that we do, and this results in failure to aid. It also results in increasing inequality. Um, Institutions like the United Nations involve the attempted collaboration of hundreds or thousands of people who are largely anonymous to each other. And the tragedy of the commons is a feature of human behavior that is an expression of the limitations of our willingness to cooperate. So essentially, the tragedy of the commons is where a human group, say a tribe, have an area of land that their cows are grazing on, and if they graze in an unrestricted way, they'll degrade the resource, and all the cows will die, and the community will be hungry. And in order to facilitate cooperation, you require trust of your neighbours. You needed to be able to identify free riders and punish free riders. But global collective action problems like limiting carbon emissions involve hundreds of millions of people who are anonymous to each other, whose contributions make no discernible difference to the outcome. So just to put it bluntly, we're not psychologically set up to deal with global collective action problems like climate change. We don't have the moral motivations that are, are fit for that sort of world. That was the central thesis of Unfit for the Future. So first of all, there 1% of people are psychopaths. That means with 8 billion people, there would be 80 million psychopaths who can now release weapons that can kill not 100 or 200 people, but thousands or millions of people. So those are not good odds. And secondly, all of us have psychological limitations that are obstacles to the sorts of global collective action problems that are involved with climate change. So Steven Pinker had this book that said, we've never lived in a safer world, that our risk of dying from violence was lower than ever before, and that's true. But the risk that we present to ourselves increases exponentially as technology increases in power exponentially, and as our world becomes more interconnected. So 12 Monkeys is a film that illustrates this biological weapons existential threat scenario. So, our moral dispositions were that we needed to be fit to survive on our own resources. It was easier to harm our group members than to benefit them because we didn't have advanced technology, and morality, common morality that applies across the world, evolved to facilitate cooperation that improved inclusive fitness, but it was cooperation in small groups of 100 to 150. So apart from also having dispositions to violence, we have a bias towards the near future, to small numbers. We are nepotistic. We have limited synchronic cooperation. We free ride, and we're distrustful of strangers and xenophobic. So since 2008, the xenophobia that we pointed out still existed, and gave the example of the former Yugoslavia, but that xenophobia has increased enormously in its manifestation since 2008. Around 40% of humans died through violence in human history. We tend to look after our family, friends, and there are a number of reasons in evolutionary terms for that. So we're psychologically myopic, and we have the ability to empathize and sympathize, but only with single individuals. And as the numbers grow, we become numb to numbers and are less psychologically inclined to support larger groups. That's why aid programs always show a single individual suffering rather than a whole group. That's again a psychological bias. Our altruism is extremely limited. Americans value a non-American life at 1/2000th. And as I mentioned, people are less likely to give and support aid as the number of people suffering increases. So the reasons for climate change strategies failing is that the effects are uncertain. There is a bias to the near future. The effects will be borne by other people, and self-sacrifice is required. If all 7 billion people lived at the standard Western democracies, there'd be 12 times the amount of pollution, and that's clearly not possible for the world to sustain. So there have been a number of advances, both in understanding moral psychology and looking at the biological mechanisms of changing moral psychology. So these are some of the sort of studies that have shown that our moral reactions are, biologically hardwired. The presence of a dirty desk or a bitter drink makes people more harsh in their judgments. The presence of an eye makes people more honest. 3 dots shaped like a face makes people more willing to contribute to an honesty box. And when you reverse the shape, They become less willing. Closing your eyes makes you more honest and more able to empathize with other people. Laughter has the opposite effect. It makes people more utilitarian in their judgments, willing to push one individual to save five others. Sleep deprivation has the same effect, and caffeine has no effect on that. So, in the sort of striking example of the effect of biology on moral judgment, there was a study of Israeli judges that looked at the severity of their sentencing or their willingness to offer parole decisions across the day. And they found that the further away from the last meal the judge ate, the more unwilling they were to offer parole. So whether you end up in jail or not partly depends on how hungry your judge is. So all of this research shows that it's not that we make rational decisions like a computer or an artificial intelligence. We're heavily influenced by the psychological dispositions and physiological factors that affect us. Testosterone, increasing it reduces empathy, reduces trust, but increases fair bargaining. The effects of these sorts of modifications can be significant when they're at population level, even if they're small. So this is old data, but shows that increasing 3 points of IQ, increasing IQ 3% would reduce poverty by 25% and welfare recipiency by 8% and add 1.5% to GDP. So those are quite striking effects. Drugs like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or antidepressants have moral effects. They increase cooperation. Oxytocin increases trust and trustworthiness, but increases that within groups and reduces cooperation with out-group members. Oxytocin is released by the oral contraceptive pill, massage, and intercourse. One of our students, Sylvia Turbeck, showed that the anti-hypertensive propranolol reduces unconscious bias. There are also non-invasive brain stimulatory techniques, such as magnetic or electrical stimulation, that can change moral behavior. Stimulation of the right temporoparietal junction makes people less inclined to judge intentional but unsuccessful attempts to harm as wrong. Electrical stimulation has also been used to make people better liars. And there are a large number of drugs that people take, modafinil, Viagra, and so on, Ritalin to human growth hormone to increase performance in various domains. And caffeine is the largest export in the world. So here are some of the drugs which have effects on cognition. What would we aim to modify? Walter Mischel's famous marshmallow experiments involved putting 3-year-old children in front of a single marshmallow and telling them if they didn't eat that marshmallow, when he came back in 10 minutes, he would give them two. And people who were able to withstand the temptation and control impulses and delay gratification when followed up, in adolescence and early adulthood, had more motivation to succeed, more friends, and it was more correlated with their ability to enter university than their IQ was. Ritalin increases ability to delay gratification, and the reason why 10% of children in some parts of the world are on Ritalin is that it's an effective cognitive enhancer. It's also a moral enhancer. There is a study from Sweden which showed that if you put violent criminals with attention deficit disorder on Ritalin, you reduce violent reoffence by 30%. So ability to control impulses and delay gratification would be a candidate for both cognitive and moral enhancement. So we don't know what the genetic contributions to variations in impulse control and ability to delay gratification are, um, but it's almost certain that there is some genetic contribution that would be amenable to gene editing. Um, Greg showed the book on love drugs. And I've mentioned the polygamous voles who were made monogamous through genetic engineering. Now, if you want to see the power of genes to modify behavior, um, you only have to look at one of the great experiments that humans have conducted over 10,000 years, and that's the selective breeding of dogs. There are 300 different breeds of dogs. They come from a small group of canids and wolves. And some are vicious, some are placid, some are intelligent, some are stupid, some are hardworking, some are lazy. That's all genetic. It's not environmental. Now, you can disable a Doberman by hitting it over the head with a hammer, but no matter what environment you provide to a Chihuahua, it will never be able to defeat a Doberman in a fight. Now, this is just a crude sort of illustration that the power of genes to change not just diseases, but behavior is extraordinary. And gene editing, polygenic editing, would bring forward what took 10,000 years into a single generation. I mentioned fluorescent animals that have been created through genetic engineering. On the right is a fluorescent human embryo that wasn't implanted, but was that involved the insertion of genes from a jellyfish. And I mentioned super mouse before as well. So the experiments on non-human animals have shown extraordinary changes, not just in resistance to cancer, but in sexual behavior, in ability to work hard, in how long mice live, and also uh, how strong they are. So this is a Belgian blue cow. So what might we be able to do in humans? I've mentioned impulse control and attention deficit disorder, sex drive in pedophiles. There have been a number of biological strategies to dealing with pedophilia. A number of US states allow or require various forms of castration to reduce sexual impulses, and drugs like cyproterone acetate have been used as chemical castrators to reduce those kinds of impulses. Now, I'm not suggesting that pedophilia is a genetic disorder, but it's possible that biological interventions at the genetic level would reduce the possibilities or the probabilities of those kinds of behaviors. So how should we make these decisions? We need a new set of rules, but principles like respect for autonomy, promotion of people's well-being, and justice in the implementation of these technologies will be necessary to sort of harness the power of gene editing. So the thesis of moral bioenhancement is not only should we make people healthier, not only should we make them more intelligent, but we should aim to make them more moral. And that if we could reduce the chance of traits like psychopathy through gene editing, if it were safe and it didn't have significant other downsides, and that's something that I'm sure that many of you will ask in question time, then we should employ gene editing just as we employ drugs today for those effects. So genes are no different from other biological actors. Genes produce proteins, and those proteins have various physiological effects. Drugs often involve proteins or other molecules that exert physiological effects. Genetic modification is just changing the origin of those proteins, um, and in itself, that makes no morally relevant difference. So let me finish there and take some questions.
Thank you, Julian. So for anyone who wants to ask a question at the bottom of the screen, and somewhere near the center, there should be a raise hand function. If you do that, I can unmute you and then you can ask the question, or you could use the chat function and I could read your question. Um, while I'm waiting for hands, I just wanted to ask, have you heard of Adrian Rain's work? So, he had the Anatomy of Violence book and he did this thing, with the island of Mauritius. So I don't think he conducted the original study. He did the follow-up, but he went back and they had this control group and then another group that they gave. The big difference in the enhancement group was they got three helpings of fish, additional helpings of fish a week. He went back 20 years later, just and looked at like incarceration rates, violence, other types of markers, and he found that higher rates of incarceration, divorce, violent incidences in the control group, and he reasoned that it might have to do with omega-3s. So then he got permission to do a study, a pilot study in prison, where they just gave omega-3 supplements, and it actually reduced the amount of violent incidences within the prison. I take it that the idea is sort of like brain development is going to influence moral development, which is going to influence behavior. And it may not be genetic in this case, but we could also see some environmental features that we could use for moral enhancement. So I guess it would be a combined approach, right, of a polygenetic kind of approach, perhaps in addition to uh, environmental things that we know through, empirical study can serve in terms of moral enhancement. So maybe like we could put money into public policy to help fund healthier diets, which are going to influence brain development, subsequently violent offenses and other types of behavior.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so um, the one question is, how much weight should we give to the sort of direct biological interventions or genetic
Mm.
interventions and other, environmental interventions? So, should we be putting more money into education, correcting social inequality rather than doing genetic research? And our argument in Unfit for the Future is that, um, investigation into biological interventions like omega-3 or gene editing have been kind of radically underexplored. People have, first of all, often argued that these are social problems, not biological problems, and that the solution should be social. Now, even if they were purely social problems, it might be that biological interventions are still the most effective. So it doesn't mean that the only strategy we should employ are social strategies. And so my approach is to say that there are four kind of ways in which you can bring about any valuable outcome, like security, reduction of violence, whatever it is that you think is important. You can change the natural environment. You can change the social environment. You can change people's psychology, or you can change biology. And we should explore all four of those in terms of their costs and benefits. So if the cheapest thing to do and the most effective thing to do is to give omega-3, then do that. Don't engage in gene editing. If the best thing to do, all things considered, is to change society, by all means do that. But those interventions have failed. Um, and I think it's time that we started to look at other alternatives. The other point that I would make is that, you said that our moral behavior is, determined by what happens in our brain, and that's exactly right. The elephant in the room of all of those problems I started with, climate change, terrorism, violence, is the human animal. And uh, if you really want to deal with those problems, you need to, address how the animal is set up. and that's biological. Everything that matters to us is the result of what happens in our brains. So even if um, the cause of some behavior results from the brain, but results from social causes. For example, Michael Meany has shown that if you deprive rats of love, you change the development of their hippocampus permanently through epigenetic changes. So even if the cause is lack of love, the manifestation will be through biology. So I think we have a reason to look at biology more seriously.
Next question is from Eric Peterson. Let me allow you to talk. Eric?
Great. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Julian, thank you so much for your talk. Very interesting. I have two questions. One, I guess, is kind of minor, um, just related to something you mentioned about um, like our through observations or studies that we realize we're not good at empathizing for collectives. I think you said something like that, that we're good at empathizing with individuals. And one question I have with that is why maybe that's just that we don't think of empathy as something to be cultivated or like that there's a virtue for empathy or even related to that. I mean, empathy requires a kind of imagining, and it seems that we could uh, cultivate a kind of moral imagining and get better at empathizing these sort of collective problems, or empathizing with future individuals or a collective group. Um, my my second question um, is I'm wondering if the gene editing for sort of moral enhancement might actually sort of like kind of run up against our respect for autonomy. And I guess what I'm thinking of, there's a value that comes from a sort of moral reformation, right? And I feel like you would agree that throughout history, or maybe even interpersonally, people can talk about like moral reformation, that they once thought something or once acted in a certain way, and that they've grown through it, or they've sort of been kind of reformed, or have grown virtue or something like that. That if we didn't have that, if we just enhanced it out, so there isn't this kind of, it seems like we're taking away a good, at least in the sense that people would be the ultimate source of their choosing to come towards that new end or that reformation. And that seems like that might be kind of a kind of not respecting autonomy.
Yeah, thanks for those excellent questions. Yeah, very thoughtful, and yeah, the subject, each of them of another talk. So just with respect to the first question about the value of empathy, one of the big questions in this debate is, well, okay, this sounds very good in theory, maybe psychopathy is a bad thing, but what are you going to really morally enhance? Are you going to enhance empathy, for example?
Mm.
And because, there are these limitations in the way people empathize. And so Peter Singer and Paul Bloom, argue that empathy is bad and that we shouldn't be enhancing it because it represents an obstacle to, correctly calculating what our response should be to, 10,000 sort of people suffering rather than 10 people suffering. And so that they argue that empathy is not something that is a moral trait that ought to be enhanced. So I have a paper with my co-author on most of this stuff, Ingemar Persson, where we respond to that, and we say the way that humans are currently set up is that um, what motivates them to act is empathy, not just calculation. So that you need both cognitive elements about, what is the right thing to do in this situation, and then you need to have motivation to actually bring that about. And empathy is, we speculate, given, the current construction of the human animal and psychology, the thing that you know, is necessary for moral action. Now, if
Mhm.
that's not true, then maybe we don't need to enhance empathy, but we argue that we should, aim to expand empathy and moral imagination beyond just the individual, as a way of facilitating moral action. But, you know, what we've sketched is just a sketch, really. It's just a sort of an outline for a program of research that, we think is, more important than cancer research because the future of humanity is sort of involved, but that really, is just not occurring. And your second question is also very good about, this is something that people say that means matter, that how we arrive at moral progress is important in many different ways. And that, for example, reading Tolstoy,
Hmm.
and improving through that is better than taking a pill to achieve the same thing. Um, Now, let's grant that's correct. Then we should prefer to, get children reading Tolstoy than giving them pills. But again, you have to evaluate the whole situation. How expensive, how difficult, how, likely is it that they will read those things, and balance the overall package. And I also have this kind of relatively, in my mind, a field famous paper called The God Machine that says that even if moral enhancement removed people's freedom, it might still be justifiable. So,
Hmm.
I have the example of a machine that is able to read. It's a super, like this is into the future. This, machine can read everyone's mind, and it can detect what their intentions are, and if their intentions are and it also can read data from the whole environment. It's like a sort of God machine. And it just intervenes to change intentions that involve violence against an individual or groups for no good reason, in a circumstance where there's no justification. And I say that, it might be useful to implement the God machine because it would just reduce so much violence or so much killing, that the loss of the freedom to kill is not a particularly important loss. So this was a response to John Harris and others who have said that morally enhancing people will reduce their freedom. And the response is, well, you know, if the benefits of reducing their freedom are so great, maybe we should reduce their freedom. But the second arm of that argument is that in many cases, um, moral enhancements won't reduce people's freedom. So women are more empathetic than men on average. So if you made men more like women, you wouldn't make them less free or less autonomous. Um, you would simply enable them to deliberate in a different way. So I think some moral enhancements will unjustifiably undermine freedom and autonomy. Um, some will undermine freedom and autonomy and be justified, and some won't undermine freedom or autonomy. And I think the Ritalin is a good example of something that increases freedom because the ability to delay gratification is just the ability to go for a larger reward in the future than a smaller reward in the present. And if you can go for future awards as well as present rewards, you're opening up your options, you're expanding your possibilities of autonomy. So I actually think that Ritalin for ADHD is an example of not just a cognitive enhancer, not just a moral enhancer, but an autonomy enhancer.
There's a question by a student, Shelby. I'll read it in 1 second. I just want to follow up on your answer, the first part to Eric's question. It gets me thinking. So yeah, Peter Singer, Paul Bloom have this kind of argument against empathy. It's sort of interesting. Without taking a stand on that, I have a kind of curious question about like moral foundations theory, right? So one of the questions is like, what will we aim to modify? And you gave some examples, impulse control, maybe increasing empathy. And then that obviously leads to the question, who gets to decide what what the moral traits are. Um, and I wonder if so two-part question. I wonder if there's a political component, right? Because then you get into Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, where he says liberals value these types of traits, conservative. Now, whether or not you agree with that, you could weigh in on. Um, if that's true, right, like is loyalty a trait we should try to enhance? Is empathy, which seems to be more liberal value, should that be something we attempt to enhance? Um, who gets to decide? And then the second part of that question is you said earlier to my question that, these other enhancements have failed, like the biological one holds the most promise, especially given the size of these problems. Do you worry about the political changes in who would make the decisions about biological enhancement, right? Could you imagine how the Trump administration would decide what values should be enhanced? And in a world where that influence is going to happen, right? We have these fluctuations in policy, we have these fluctuations in perceptions of value. In an ideal world, we would have an ethical committee that can decide objectively what we think the right types of enhancements would be. In a politicized world where that's probably not going to happen, we're going to have targeted, sort of politicized values influencing which enhancements we think are most germane and most beneficial for society. So do you worry about that kind of, that different political perspectives, the moral foundations differences, and which foundations we see as most paramount, and then how that might be amplified on a policy level?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge problem. And
Yeah,
like I said, it's just the beginning of a research
yeah,
program. I'm not particularly attracted by Jonathan Haidt's foundations theory.
yeah,
So in the book, we argue that two traits, that would be candidates for moral enhancement were altruism and a sense of justice. So, I think you should start with the lowest hanging fruit. So I mentioned psychopathy, but I think that I also mentioned how you know, unwilling we were to make sacrifices for others. I think, um, creating minimal levels of altruism where people are willing to perform easy rescues, where the cost to them is small and the benefit to others, either individually or collectively, if people collectively make those sacrifices, I think would be, relatively uncontroversial ways to start. But as you say, there's controversy about what a good or virtuous person is. And in order to implement this sort of program, you need to have some sort of vision or blueprint for that. I just say this, that at the moment, random chance decides. So
yeah,
you've only got to do better than random chance to improve the situation. And you know, as this is why I don't think this should be a state run program. I think it should be voluntary, uh, and according to the views of parents, essentially, who are having the children. And I think what you're likely to see are what Tristram Inglehart called moral islands. And so I think you may see the fracturing of society as, people who are, super rich decide to have, musically talented, intellectually gifted children, but also children who have certain moral traits that can create a super community for themselves. So, you know, cooperative, but also wary of people exploiting them or, being taken advantage of. And so they will want their children to be, and this is what education does. Education itself is creating a certain sort of child, certain sort of citizen, and gene editing is just amplifying that and writing it into the genes of the next generation. Um, so I actually think this is the most important question society is facing now, because you know it's not likely that in the next 10 to 20 years that gene editing of embryos will become widespread. But what is widespread already is education. And what kind of education should we be, ethical, moral education should we be giving our children?
Mm.
At the moment they're brainwashed in different ways, and I think that a lot of those ways are very bad. And let's get it straight. I think that social influences, as I mentioned, Meany's experiments can have profound effects. If you brainwash a child, you can, destroy their lives, or, if you sexually abuse a child, you can ruin their life forever. So, we have a reason to sort of address this problem that you're raising now.
Mhm. Yeah. Shelby Leeds has a question. What has been the response from the devoutly religious community with regard to gene editing?
I don't know. I don't mix much with the devoutly religious community, I have to say. That we're generally in different worlds. I was invited to Spain by a kind of religious community, and they were quite open-minded to the idea. Um, I think, there are going to be, like anything, different views in the religious community. In on one view, we're made in the image of God. We shouldn't be interfering in, God's gift to us. Um, and, we should be practicing, religion as a way of, realizing God's vision. So that's a very bioconservative approach. But another view, I think, which I have experienced, is that, God has given us these gifts to use and to employ for the betterment of human beings, and that applies to disease, but also to how people live, and some willingness to employ these technologies, particularly for treatment of disease, but also for the enhancement of traits. So one of the things that does have a genetic contribution is religiosity. So if you look at identical twin research, religiosity has a significant genetic contribution. So it's possible you could use gene editing to make people more likely to be religious or less likely to be religious, and that's a sort of controversial area. There's also polygenic scores for same-sex behavior. I wrote a commentary in Nature Human Behavior on such a score. So it's likely that you could do polygenic editing and make people more likely or less likely to engage in same-sex behavior. Now, the same-sex behavior example is a very interesting one of what's called pleiotropy. So pleiotropy is the idea that genes don't just have one effect, they have multiple effects. So in diseases, if you have one copy of the gene for cystic fibrosis, you're also more resistant to diarrheal diseases. So there's a sort of positive and a negative. And in the same-sex behavior study, they found that people who had a higher polygenic score predicting same-sex behavior also had more openness to experience, were more likely to be risk-taking, had more charisma. So you get this package of, you're so I'm not, I don't have a view on one way or the other whether disposition to same-sex behavior is something you should choose or shouldn't choose. But if you choose against it, you might be choosing, a less risk-taking, less charismatic, less open to experience individual. So I think that's going to be the really interesting thing about genetics, that, there is, and even something like psychopathy, which doesn't seem to have significant upsides. Even business people who are psychopaths often, destroy their companies. Maybe it does. Maybe I saw this Free Solo with Alex Hanold, the climber, and they did an MRI of his sort of amygdala, and it doesn't light up. He doesn't have kind of fear in sort of situations, and maybe that's sort of on the hard-headedness spectrum, and maybe there are benefits to having what's sometimes called hard-headedness. So I think this is going to be the exciting area of this sort of research in the future.
Yeah. A little antidote to Shelley's question and your response, which is like from the religious perspective, it could go either way, I guess. I used to teach at Brooklyn College, and in Brooklyn College, there's a large community of Ashkenazi Jews, and they still engage in arranged marriages. But because the gene pool has been small over time, Tay-Sachs is a very prominent genetic disorder within the community. So they use genetic testing as a form of sort of like negative eugenics, right? So everyone in the community gets tested. They plug them into the database. If one's a carrier, they permit the marriage because you need both parents to be carriers for the child to have Tay-Sachs. If both potential mates are carriers, they prohibit the marriage and they marry them to someone else. So there's a religious community that's using sort of at least genetic testing to try to reduce the prevalence of Tay-Sachs disease within the community. Yeah, yeah, that's a good.
Well, there's another one that, I mean, when you talked about, when we talked about, I think it was Eric Peterson,
Yeah, yeah,
uh, raised this question about, the means of achieving sort of moral progress.
yeah.
In the 1980s, Cyprus had such high levels of thalassemia that 50% of the drug budget and 100% of the blood supply went to treating thalassemia. So it was just destroying the country. And at around this time, it became possible to do testing, prenatal testing, and have selective termination of pregnancy.
Mm,
And actually, it was the church that said, in order to get married, you must have carrier testing for thalassemia.
mm,
Now, it didn't then say you must go on and have prenatal testing and you must have an abortion. But 99% of people who found out that they were both carriers went on to have prenatal testing and went on to have termination of pregnancy, and the rates of thalassemia dropped significantly in Cyprus. So this was coercion. So
mhm,
this was mandatory genetic testing. But the level of coercion, I think, was very small
mm,
and, definitely proportional to the benefits. And so it shows you that, complete freedom is not necessarily the only justifiable policy.
yeah. Still many of you out there. If anyone has a question, you could raise your hand or type it into the chat. I'll give you a second to do that. Um, I do think the analysis, while I'm waiting to see if anyone has a question, I think the analysis is a really important one in terms of our values evolved in a world that doesn't fit the modern context, right? So I used to teach environmental ethics a lot, and it does seem, I think you called it, I didn't ever know this term, causal sense of responsibility, where, um, you know, causes were proximate in distance and space, right? So like you punched me, you caused me some harm. I could see the cause of the harm. We could identify who's responsible. And that evolved for very obvious reasons. In a world where climate change is the problems that we're confronting and the potential of pandemics, the values that we evolved in that world are very hard to apply to these kinds of problems. So I really see this as a kind of really important question. How do we change the human system, this moral psychology, so that we can actually address these much larger problems? And I guess, enhancement is one of those.
Yeah, I mean, the,
Uh,
the traditional sort of naive approach is, oh, we just have to educate them better and tell them, and then they'll change their behavior. And that just doesn't work. And then what happened was Thaler and Sunstein, had
mhm,
this sort of very simple nudge solution that you take advantage of these psychological
mhm.
biases to try to nudge people. Now, that's fine. I don't have any problem with nudge, but
Yeah,
it's incredibly weak. And you're not going to
yeah,
nudge people into sort of, managing a pandemic or climate change. I
yeah.
mean, that's just not going to be powerful enough. So, I think we just haven't really grasped the magnitude of the psychological and biological problem that we present to ourselves.
Yeah. Any last questions? Give you guys one more moment. All right. If not, we will let Julian go rest. Thanks. Oh, wait, there's one more. Sorry. I will read this. Is it Carito? Carito? Sorry if I got the name wrong. In Against Perfection, Sandel argues that expanding genetic testing enhancement risks undermining humility, solidarity, and the unconditional acceptance of children. Given your defense of procreative beneficence and moral permissibility, even desirability of selecting embryos with the best genetic prospects, how do you respond to the concern that widespread genetic testing may subtly transform parental love into a project of optimizing rather than acceptance? Where, if anywhere, do you, and then the question didn't finish, but I take it he's asking about,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, Sandel has this idea that if you allow genetic selection or gene editing, it will result in hyperparenting that, will parents, if they select to have a more intelligent child, they'll just be forcing that child to study all the time. Or if they choose some sort of musical talent, they'll be, forcing the child to do 6 hours of piano practice and hyperparenting, and won't unconditionally accept the child and enable the child to sort of develop their talents as they choose. So that's his objection. The reality is that already occurs. Like America is full of hyper parents, and so is China, so is other. Lang Lang, the concert pianist in China, his father told him to commit suicide when he didn't get into, the Chinese School of Music, Academy of Music. And so, first of all, hyper parenting is a vice. It occurs now. People don't accept their children as ends in themselves and enable them to develop their talents and choose their life as they wish. And I agree, that's a problem. We should deal with that now. Now, that's completely separate to editing of embryos that where there is no child yet. It's deciding what talents and limitations that future child will have. And so I can't see a necessary connection between, say, increasing a child's mathematical ability and forcing the child to, exercise that ability. It's really a question of how we parent, that is already a problem. And I think that, giving people options without forcing them to exercise those options, is a part of being a good parent. So I think that he makes a kind of claims there's a sort of psychological determinism that links selection to hyperparenting that I just think doesn't exist. I think we need to be wary of that, and we need to prevent it. On solidarity and humility, again, the same sorts of things. I think that solidarity and humility are things that are not necessarily dependent on whether we're engaging in practices of gene editing and can be independently fostered. So it's a little bit like this objection that the Down syndrome community often give to Down syndrome screening. They say, oh, if you allow Down syndrome screening, this will reduce the tolerance people have to people existing with Down syndrome. It will reduce support. It will increase prejudice against people who have Down syndrome or haven't chose to terminate a pregnancy. And so we should get rid of Down syndrome screening. Right. Now, I agree that there is prejudice against people with Down syndrome, not enough support for them, and so on. But the solution to that is not to get rid of Down syndrome screening. It's to address those bad attitudes and practices, through education, through, providing, social supports and so on. So, an extension of Sandel's argument would be, well, should we just get rid of genetic testing if it has these effects on diseases? So people like Sandel and Jürgen Habermas and bioconservatives often accept genetic selection or editing for diseases, but they draw this bright line between disease and enhancement. And I don't think that any bright line does exist. And the same arguments apply to disease as apply to enhancements, and the same arguments in favor also apply to enhancements.
I just want to credit the questioner. It was from Carolina Villagas, sorry. And she says, thank you for your answer. So let's thank Julian. I appreciate your time. And that was a wonderful talk. It gave us a lot to think about. And I know you're coming to us from Australia. So thank you for the time difference and
Yeah,
for
thank you for the excellent questions. Very good questions. Well done.
thank you. And I'll send
Bye
you the
bye.
video once it's available. All right. Bye.
Yes, please. Thanks. Bye bye.